Hi, this is Teddy, and you're listening to Mary Annaïse Heglar on Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast Podcast Network.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly Pollack with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast family of podcasts, and I am joined today by Mary Annaïse Heglar. Hello, Mary.
Hello, how are you?
Great. So, Mary, you describe yourself on Twitter, I think, as somebody who writes and rants and raves about climate justice. I've heard other people refer to you as a climate essayist.
Yeah.
How do you like to be introduced?
So I started calling myself a climate justice essayist because when I first started writing, I sort of felt like calling myself a writer was too big and it felt like overwhelming. So I was like, okay, I just write essays. And so I started calling myself an essayist, and then it caught on. I was like, oh, okay. So at this point, I think writer is fine.
And you're a podcaster too. You're the co-host of
Yes.
Real Hot Take podcast.
Hot Take podcast.
Hot
we
Take.
just,
yes.
Yeah, the Twitter handle is Real Hot Take because Hot Take was taken.
Gotcha. So tell me a little bit about how you got into doing this kind of writing. You know, I assume that you didn't, as a kid, think I'm going to be a climate essayist at some point. So, you know, how did you come to this work?
Yeah, well, as a kid, I didn't think I was going to write, climate essays because I didn't know about climate as a kid. But I definitely thought I was going to be a writer as a kid, for sure. So it's more like I came back to writing than came to it. So if anybody who knew me from high school or college, if you told them I was, a writer now, they'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. But if anyone who knows me from my professional life would be like, really? So I had always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a little kid. And then when I got to college, I read the autobiography of Langston Hughes and realized that he's one of my favorite writers. And I realized that he almost starved to death several times in his pursuit of being a writer. And I was like, well, if he almost starved to death, then I probably will. So I need like a side hustle. I need a backup plan. So I decided I was going to move to New York City and work in publishing, which, I felt like that would at least have me close to books. And I knew that was something that Toni Morrison did. She worked in publishing for a long time before she became a writer on her own. And so I went into publishing, realized publishing didn't pay very well. And I went into nonprofit communications, which you would be surprised, but actually you can actually support yourself on that salary much better than you can in publishing. And so that's where I went, and I eventually decided I wanted to be part of telling the most important story, which in 2014 I decided that was climate. And so I went into nonprofit for environmental groups. I went to one of the big green groups in our DC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. And, I worked there I still work there editing policy reports, which if you read between the lines, which if you are an editor, you will do, it's terrifying. And you see, these horrible things that are happening. And you see that like behind every statistic, there's people, there's millions of people who are suffering horribly and projected to suffer even more in the future. And the more you think about that, the more terrifying it becomes. And I decided I needed to process those feelings. And the best way I know to process my feelings is through writing. And it went from there.
So you had this piece that was really big last summer, I think, that was about, that you didn't care if somebody recycles.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and where that came from? I remember reading it at the time and being like, oh, right. Yes, this is great. Why didn't anyone ever say this before?
Well, I think more and more people are starting to talk about it that way. So what I really wanted to get into in that piece was that I do care if you recycle, but I don't believe that your recycling or like your personal greenness is the price of admission to the climate movement. I think that the purity test and the green shaming that we have in the climate movement is really problematic and exclusionary. So I got the idea for that when I was speaking on this panel last March. And someone asked this question of, I'm working on, or I'm participating in a boycott for, toilet tissue that uses wood from the boreal forest, which is a really important forest. And she was like, is that meaningful? Is that useless? And what I tried to explain to her was like, no, of course that's not useless, but it shouldn't be your stopping point. And that your individual actions, yes, of course they matter. Because if I tell you that your individual action doesn't matter, then you sort of crumble and fall. But as an individual, you're more than just a consumer. You're also a citizen. You're also like so many other things. You're also an influencer to the other people in your lives. And the way that we've defined individual action has been just what you buy and what you use. And so I wanted to really dismantle that myth. And I also wanted to get rid of like the shame that people have about I'm not green enough and my home isn't on solar panels and I'm not vegan and I'm not perfect yet and therefore I can't speak about climate because that's bullshit and it's harmful and it's sort of stifling the conversation and hamstringing the movement.
Yeah, I love that. And I have felt it to be very freeing, I think, hearing this expressed by you and by some other people more recently that, that we alone, that sounds like Donald Trump, we alone can't fix it. But, we alone can't. Yeah, that we need to be part of the solution, but we aren't the entire solution, is really, it makes me feel like, gives me a sense of purpose again. That if I feel like it's completely my fault and I've messed up that I don't have, and if I feel like, I can't there's nothing I can do to solve it, doesn't give me a sense of purpose. But knowing that I can be part of the solution is really nice.
Yeah, I think we need to stop thinking so much about what we can't do alone and start thinking more about what everyone else can't do without us. Right. So it's like, it is true that you can't fix it all by yourself, but it's also true that we can't fix it without you.
I love that. It's clear that you are focusing a lot on emotions as you're thinking about how to talk about these things. And, I feel like, I'm 41. And so, I've seen this sort of long history of the way climate's been talked about over the past 20 plus years of this.
You're only 5 years older than me.
I'm an elder at this point. No, I just, in general, I remember how things were talked about. There was sort of the doom and gloom of the ozone layer, deteriorating, and then it got very scientific, and it's very interesting that it has started to turn back to emotion and an emotional appeal now, and that's something that you're clearly focusing on with your work. Do you think that emotional appeals are going to be more effective than the more scientific way of approaching it more recently has been?
Yeah, I think we have all the science, we understand the problem from a scientific standpoint, and the scientists have not been listened to. And I think the role of the rest of us is to make enough noise that they are listened to, make enough noise that it's clear that we do care about this, right? So when a scientist and other experts have tried to elevate this topic, they've been told, well, the general public doesn't care. And now we're seeing the general public is making it very clear, no, we really care. It seems like that table is turning, and that's necessary, right? So I often hear people say like, oh, we have the solutions, we just don't have political will. Well, that's where the emotion comes in. That is how you get political will. And also, David Roberts wrote a piece about this in Vox recently, that the political will is not a nice to have. It's not an afterthought. It's actually everything. And so I look at any other issue out there, like any other social issue that people care about, it's full of emotion, because that shows caring is an emotion. There's just no other way to express that. You can't express that you care about something in dry clinical terms.
Do you think that is something that's happening more, that people are picking up on? Obviously you're using emotion in your work. Are you seeing that in other activism, other writing that's happening?
Yes. 1,000%. It's becoming a far more emotional, but not even just emotional, just an honest conversation. Because honestly, the thing that was most perplexing to me when I joined the climate space in earnest was that nobody was talking about how terrifying it was. And it really, you kind of feel like you're being gaslit because it's objectively terrifying, but everybody's acting like it's fine. That is a very weird position to be in. And so now it's just like to have that dam break loose. You can talk about it in a way that just like you don't feel so isolated anymore. And isolated people are not very good activists. Isolated people are not very good at, pressing for change. So the more we talk about this with more honesty, the more we can sort of like break down the barriers between one another and become a community and become, a wave for change.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what climate justice means. So, we started off at the top saying that was in your Twitter bio that you write about climate justice. And this is a term I think is also starting to be used more than it had been previously, and rightly so. But what does climate justice mean to you, and how do you approach looking at that?
I think climate justice means just a right to a livable world. And so it can be enacted in a million different ways. It could be enacted by, shutting down fossil fuel companies and forcing them to pay for climate adaptation. It could be enacted through climate reparations to, the countries on the front lines of the climate crisis who by and large had nothing to do with the creation of the climate crisis. And sort of, I think at its very core, climate justice is just justice.
Fair.
Yeah.
You wrote a piece about how the climate crisis isn't the first existential crisis, and that we can really learn something from communities of color who've been on the front lines of organizing and movement building for a really long time. Could you unpack that a little bit for me? Because I think that sort of ties together a lot of these pieces that we're talking about, that you can't be isolated. We need to be coming together as communities, being honest and truthful about what is going on and the emotions that are there, but also then this piece of climate justice.
Yeah. So I got the idea for that piece when I was reading A Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King. And I was just overwhelmed by how much of it related to how I felt about the climate crisis, and how, he talks in there about how the silence of your friends is, more damaging than the hateful words of your enemies. That is not a direct quote. I mangled that. And that is honestly how it was feeling at that time, because there was a lot of like, wait and see. This is when Sunrise was going up against Nancy Pelosi largely. And so that was something that was like really ringing in my ears. And also, like, I posted a quote from James Baldwin on Twitter, and, I'm in climate Twitter, which meant that at that time I was followed by, mostly white climate activists. And the way they reacted to a James Baldwin quote was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And it was like, y'all have never read James Baldwin, have you? And it was like, that was a very well-known quote. And so I was like, y'all need to read some more James Baldwin. You need to read Martin Luther King, because like, y'all don't realize that there are actually like these things that you're struggling to express. Someone has felt them before. Someone has expressed them before. There is language for this, and you need to get out of your silo and go read it. And so that was basically where I was coming from with that. And I also was listening to this podcast, and they were talking about the St. Louis race riots of the early 1900s. And there was like this really horrible race riot. And by race riot, it was just basically a mass lynching. The white folks in St. Louis were just murdering and slaughtering Black people. And it was so bad that they were like setting their neighborhoods on fire, and they had to swim across the water to East St. Louis. And it reminded me so much of what I was reading about Camp Fire at the time. And like the people in East St. Louis, I actually might be getting this messed up. It might have been East St. Louis that had the riot in St. Louis, but one of those two cities, they're right across from one another. But the people on the other side of the river overheard the damage, and they thought it was a natural disaster. They didn't know what it was. And, thinking about that, like, as far as they're concerned, that is an existential threat, right? Like, their existence is threatened. That is what an existential threat means, right? Like, it might not be the end of the whole entire world, but if you're dead, it might as well be. If you, like, have no option for a future, it might as well be. And that was, I think, where people got the courage to, like, stand up and fight. And, like, at the time, it felt completely and utterly hopeless to them. But they still found the courage to at least try, because not trying was a slow suicide.
It sounds like maybe there are a couple of things that that you would then encourage people to read besides your own pieces to look at this. A letter from a Birmingham jail. Are there like particular James Baldwin pieces that you would recommend that people read?
Yeah, as far as fiction from James Baldwin, I'd recommend If Beale Street Could Talk. I think that novel does a really beautiful job of showing how to find the courage to love other people and love yourself, even in the face of pretty much certain tragedy. Any James Baldwin essay is going to get you together, but I definitely say start with The Fire Next Time. It's one of my favorites. Also, Arundhati Roy writes beautiful essays on this topic. So one of her collections is The End of Imagination. Highly recommend that. Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents is two novels that she wrote, I believe, in the 80s or 90s, but it reads like a newsreel today, and it's almost like instructions for living in this era. Amitav Ghosh has a beautiful essay collection, The Great Derangement, about the lack of climate storytelling in pop culture today. So I highly recommend that. And also his latest novel, Gun Island, does a really good job of weaving in climate narratives. And I could go on for literal ever, but I'll stop there.
I think that you should maybe start a reading club.
I'm thinking about it. Oh, just one more. What We're Fighting For Now Is Each Other by Wynne Stevenson is another really great book. That's the one that picked me up off of my feet when I was, at my deepest climate despair.
So you and I first interacted when you posted something, I think it was right after Christmas last year on Twitter about that we should stop asking climate activists what gives us hope and start asking how can I help. That then I had the pleasure of turning into a little op-ed for Demcast. So I wonder if we could maybe close out by talking about that a little bit, because, it is such a natural, misguided but natural question for people to want to be given hope. To say, all right, make me feel better. You're telling me we're gonna run out of time in 11 years. Make me feel better about it. And you're asking instead that people say, how can I help? What can I do to make it better? Or what is giving you, courage and inspiration right now? Can you talk a little bit about that and why we should stop asking climate activists what gives you hope?
Well, I think it depends on a little bit more about why people are asking and what their understanding of hope is. Because the thing about hope and what makes it so precious is that it has to be earned, and no one else can earn it for you. And generally, when people are asking what gives you hope, what they're asking me for is reassurance that it's going to be okay. And I can't give anyone that, because you have to earn that for yourself. And I think that's why Greta struggles with it so much, right? Like in one of her many steering speeches, she was like, how dare you ask me to come here and give you hope? That is not my job. And I often hear people say that I have hope because the kids are involved. Yeah, that's totally the wrong way to look at the youth movement. Like, you should look at the youth movement and see an indictment of the previous generations instead of hope for the future generations. Right? Like, children don't get active like that unless they're under extreme duress. Right? Like, the only other time I can think of, and I'm sure there are plenty of others, but the only other time I can think of where children were this active en masse is the civil rights movement. And those children were scared for their lives and willing to risk anything for it. And I think that's the exact same thing that we're seeing today. So I bristle at hope because I think we've sort of used the wrong equation when we talk about climate. We think hope leads to action, and actually it doesn't. Courage leads to action, and action leads to hope. It's the other way around. So I think what people are asking is, what makes you get up every day and face this? And it's not hope, it's courage. And in my case, it's spite. And it's also a great deal of anger and a great deal of love that makes me stand up and face this. It is not about hope to me.
That's beautiful. I really like that. And I think that's important. You know, I've got 2 little kids who think about climate a lot because of course they do. You know, that kids can't help but think about it right now if they've been exposed to it. And I like this idea of using that language with them, the language of courage and inspiration.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to make sure that we talk about today?
I would like to shamelessly plug my new podcast.
Yes, please do.
So my podcast is called Hot Take. I am the co-host with Amy Westervelt, who also does another amazing podcast called Drills, where they just released a new season of that, looking at how the fossil fuel industry has manipulated the narrative in this really grotesque way. But on Hot Take, we do sort of like climate media criticism, where we take a intersectional lens, looking at the climate conversation in traditional media and like the latest articles of the day and our favorites of the whatever time frame. We just finished doing years in review for the Trump era, so 2016 to 2019. I think next week we'll be releasing an episode for January, and then going forward we'll be bi-weekly. So you should subscribe. We're on all podcast platforms, and yeah, we're very excited about it.
Yeah, excellent. I definitely think that everyone should check that out. Great, and everybody should follow you on Twitter too.
Oh yeah, I am on there.
Excellent. Well, I will put links to your podcast and your Twitter, and then these pieces that we were talking about too that people should read on our website when we post this episode. So people should go check out the show notes too.
Okay.
All right. Well, Mary, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I really enjoy following you on Twitter, and I just love your writing. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Wethlin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.